Hi, welcome to Tuesday Talks.
Yeah, thank you guys for being with us again this week as we get ready to wrap up Written in Stone.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
going to be a good week.
yeah, dealing with three commandments this week that all really kind of go together. So, looking forward to it.
Yeah. If you didn't watch the parent webinar from Sunday, highly encourage you to go watch that as we talked about some of the things that are going to be coming up in CSM. So go watch that video after you finish this one or save it to watch with your parents or another time.
Yeah, even in the next couple of weeks, we've got some big things coming up. So, go ahead and watch that. I'll let you know kind of what we have coming up in the next couple of weeks, things you definitely want to get registered for, as well as kind of how we're going to move throughout the summer.
Yep. Happy birthday, Alex Stepp. I saw it was his birthday.
Okay.
Faith Ward and Emily Braun.
Oh,
So middle schooler.
yeah.
Awesome.
Happy quarantine birthday, guys.
Yes.
Although it's loosening up. I don't know if these can be considered a really quarantine birthday.
Right.
You can go out to restaurants now.
You may be able to get a birthday
Yeah.
cake actually.
Yeah.
Have some friends over.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, we are going to get into our passage, I think. So
Exodus 14, 15, and 17. So commandments 7, 8, and 10. So real quick, just overview. Commandment 7 is you shall not commit adultery. Commandment 8 is you shall not steal. And Commandment 10 is not to covet. So we're going to be talking about these three and how really they all three kind of go together, and how Commandment 10 kind of leads to 8, 7, and 8, but also other commandments as well.
Yep. So as we think through these things, these are some of the commandments also that people don't have a big issue with.
Yep.
You know, stealing is probably the second most agreed upon commandment, I would think, because most people feel that pain when you take something from them. That's one of those things that kind of proves that there is a sense of morality people have, and that it is wrong for you to take something from me, even if I can figure out a way maybe that it could be right for me to take it from you. We feel that pain, we feel an injustice. So we usually understand about stealing, but these other two commandments are very closely related to that.
Yeah, and so in verse 14, the seventh commandment, you shall not commit adultery. As I was kind of preparing for this, I was reading a study, and in the study it said that even 92% of Americans still think committing adultery is wrong, even if they are religiously unaffiliated. The season of life didn't really matter, but just in general, 92% of Americans believe committing adultery is wrong, which leaves a minority of 8% that believe it isn't wrong. So you can see that even the what's the word I'm looking for? Like the predominant thinking of marriage is that it is supposed to be a committed relationship, that you're not supposed to step out on the other.
Yeah. So people understand that, and I think part of that is also connected to that when you make that decision to be connected to someone in a covenant relationship, you want them to be faithful to you.
Absolutely.
Although it is difficult at times to be faithful to the other person. They upset you, or you're tempted in some way, or something comes along that causes you expect that from the other person, that this person's going to be faithful in our relationship that we have.
Yeah, the reality is there's temptations all around, which is why so many marriages end in divorce. And divorce was never God's intention for marriage. Marriage was a union that was meant to be forever, and it is only because of sin that marriage ends in divorce. Now, it doesn't always have to be both of them committing sin, but it can be, obviously a marriage is made up of two sinners, but like the sin of one can lead to the dissolution of the marriage because of the effects that it can have. So we know about forgiveness, obviously. Like forgiveness is always on the table, and we're even commanded to forgive, but sin still has consequences.
Yep, that's right. So we go back to the beginning of God's word. God creates the world. He creates man and woman, puts them in the garden together, and he creates a woman to be that mate for the man, that it's not good for him to be alone, that he desires for man to be fruitful and multiply. And so this relationship of marriage is a lifelong commitment between a man and a woman that is meant to be a glorifying thing to God
Yeah.
in that covenant relationship.
Yeah, this is the first institution we see in the Bible. This is the first man-woman relationship, the institution that is ordained by God, really as the bedrock of civilization and society. If you want to find a society or a civilization that eventually eroded, you can trace that back to the breakdown of the family, and you can see that even in America, where you see where families have been eroded, and how it just look at the statistics of single parent homes and kind of problems that arose. Now, those can definitely be worked out of, and God can redeem those situations, but that was never God's intention for how families and society and civilization was to be ordered. It was always ordained as a family.
And this picture of marriage between a man and a woman is the image that God uses to show the most intimate relationship that we're capable of understanding and being a part of. And it's no wonder then that when we get to the New Testament, Paul uses marriage as the illustration of Christ's relationship with the church. And he says, this is a great mystery to us, and it points to this idea of how Christ loves the church, and that is how marriage is supposed to be. Because of sin, it's broken, but ultimately it's supposed to be modeled after this relationship of Christ and the church. So the man leads the family and provides the direction and accountability for the family, that he is accountable to God for what goes on in that family. And the wife is supposed to come underneath the husband and support and submit, but also to be a partner in that relationship. That it is not a lesser in value or standing. It is a equal value, but we have kind of a term that we use to talk about how we work together, and I'm blanking on it right now. I don't know. I'm blanking on it at the moment. I'll think of it in a second. But we work together to help each other out, to fill in. And this is one of the amazing things we see from marriage, is that God uses marriage often to bring about sanctification. To show weaknesses in our life that, if you're single and you think, oh, I'm a pretty good Christian, like when you get married, it's a whole different ballgame, because there's someone there that is rubbing against you. It's kind of that iron sharpens iron mentality almost.
Going to know all your secrets. You're going to be incredibly vulnerable in front of them. You can't hide from that person. You can't just put on a face. And if you put on a face in public, your spouse is going to know what you're actually like behind the scenes when you're at home. So as you were saying, as Christ leads the church, and Christ is the head and gave himself for the church, and the church submits to Christ and falls under his leadership. That's the illustration of the husband and the wife. And like he was saying, it's not lesser roles. It's distinct in role, but equal in dignity. One is not superior to the other in the marriage relationship. As he was saying, the marriage relationship, it was never intended to be a means in and of itself. It was never intended to be the ends, but it was a means to point to something. Marriage was intended to be an illustration of a greater reality, and that greater reality is ultimately the gospel. As at the center of the gospel is God's sacrificial love for us in sending his son. And we violate that sacrificial love that we are supposed to be showing to our spouse when we commit adultery. We have violated the institution and the sacredness of the marriage relationship that was instituted by God. It was never his intention for us to find what we're supposed to find in marriage outside of that marriage with somebody else.
And so marriage is, a very sacred relationship, is a covenant relationship between a man and a woman, and the third part being with the Lord. That is ultimately the desire of God, is that this relationship is held together where there's two broken people. There's one perfect and holy God who is able to bring about that forgiveness and restoration, even when there's brokenness inside of it. God does not desire divorce. And Jesus even talks about, like, look, you may have it legally available to you to divorce for all different kinds of reasons, but he says, look, unless there's unfaithfulness in the relationship, you shouldn't even be talking about divorce, because this is such an image to the world of what God desires the relationship for us to have with him.
Absolutely.
So he desires to bring about restoration, even though sometimes someone is not willing to do that. Maybe there's someone who's not a believer, who's not desiring to bring about restoration or anything. And so the Lord permits those things in those cases of unfaithfulness, so that another person is not just stuck forever.
And even where, I think this is one of the things that's really important to understand about adultery and divorce, is even as divorce is seemingly given permission in this instance of adultery, which goes to show you the extreme nature of adultery and how God sees that, and how he sees that as a violation of the marriage, because the marriage institution is supposed to be an illustration of the gospel, which is not supposed to be ended by divorce. And the fact that there is seemingly this permission of divorce in the case of adultery shows how seriously that is to be taken. But even, I think even more distinct, or something very interesting, is that even as permission is given for divorce, divorce is never commanded. It's never commanded that, based on whatever instance or how terrible or tragic the situation or how bad the abuse, neglect, or mistreatment, there's never a command in the Bible to get divorced.
Right.
There are certain instances that it is given permission, and it is shown that, like, you can have a divorce in certain cases, but it's never told you have to get a divorce, because I think if it were shown, if it were, at any point it were say you have to get a divorce, what it's doing is saying grace and forgiveness and restoration is not possible. And the gospel says, no, grace and restoration and forgiveness is always possible.
Yep, that's part of the beauty of the gospel. So this, our relationships with our spouse are meant to be ones of faithfulness, where both people ideally are committed to serving the other one, loving the other one with sacrificial love, and not going after their own desires. And so this is part of what society has been pushing for a long time, is that you're supposed to do the things that you enjoy as long as you're happy. I've heard that a lot of times about relationships where people go, they don't really seem like they should go together, but as long as they're happy, that's fine. And it's like, look, the marriage will bring about joy in someone, but it's not always about just what happiness is, because if you just run off of happiness,
there's going to be instances
that roller coaster.
I've heard it. Usually you see this at the beginning of the year too, where I saw it like a lot of New Year's resolution. Like, my resolution this year is to cut the toxic people out of my life. Like, you don't even know, like, you can just say anybody in your life is toxic and just use that as an excuse to end relationships that you don't feel like working on. And unfortunately, a lot of people will carry that over into a marriage because they don't see the value in working on it, because it is a marriage of two in which they're trying to find their satisfaction in their spouse, which, again, in our marriage, we are never commanded to do. Now, we are supposed to find joy in our marriage. We're supposed to love our spouse and take pleasure in our spouse. But I think it was a book, and I know I had this in my premarital counseling before Amy and I got married, but the guy that we had our counseling with, he said marriage takes three. And at first, like, I didn't understand what he was talking about. I was like, so we gotta, like, have a kid right away? Like, what do you mean by that? What if we have more than one kid? Like so what do you mean? He's like, it's a husband, a wife, and it's God. That is the representation, and that is the illustration and how marriages are supposed to be built. So there's weight given to working on the relationship, and that you're not always going to find joy and satisfaction in that person in every situation, but you can always sacrificially love them no matter what.
Yep. And I think we can have a ton of conversation around what marriage looks like in submitting, in sacrificing, all of those kinds of things. I mean, this is why there are literally like so many books written
Yeah.
about marriage, because it's not just like a real quick snippet of here's what marriage is and just do this and
Yeah.
it's, a secret recipe or something. Everyone is different. Everyone's relationships are different. The principle here is the important thing of when we make this covenant with a spouse and with the Lord, it is a very serious thing. It's part of why we do weddings, and we do that to show the special nature of this marriage. Now, there's other things that we're talking about here that are also connected with this that are a lot less formal necessarily. So, verse 15, you shall not steal. Very simple. This is talking about things that we desire that someone else has and taking it for ourselves.
Yeah. So this was weird. As well, I was studying for this one, I was trying to think, like, I'm positive, like, as a child, I probably stole something I wasn't supposed to steal. But I can, like, it's kind of embarrassing, but I was thinking, like, what's the first thing I actually remember stealing? And I think I was in third grade, and I went over to my best friend's house. His name was Clay, and if you're like 30-ish or give or take 5 years, you probably remember the scent. But Michael Jordan had a cologne, and like I stole his Michael Jordan cologne because I wanted it. Like that's the first thing I remember stealing.
Guys, it was super cool.
It was super cool, and it smelled really good at the time. I don't even remember what it smells like, but I'm sure if I walked by somebody and they were wearing it,
it
like, that's Michael Jordan.
Yeah.
Which is timely because of the Last Dance that's been on. So, but yeah, that was the first thing I remember stealing. It was because he had it, I didn't have it, I didn't have the money for it, and I wanted it.
That's right.
So that's what we're talking about stealing, is that something that belongs to somebody else, something that is their possession, that they own, that they have a right to, and you are taking it from them without permission or without payment or anything like that.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's some things like private property and possession is kind of implied in this, that things can belong to someone, and we understand that God has given things to different people, whether it's abilities, whether it's a testimony, a story, a possession. All of those things belong to someone. And so it's wrong for me to take someone else's lyrics to a song and say they're my own.
Yeah.
Even though that's not possession.
Exactly. Like the piracy and the copywriting. Like, even I was reading an article on this one as well about like, not to get super deep into the conversation of like government and taxes and things like that, because that's a very deep and a very complex conversation if we're going to talk about like capitalism and socialism and things like that, but not to get into that. But even like if we as individuals exercising our right to vote are voting on raising taxes on somebody else but not on ourselves, something we want to take from somebody else because they have more than we have and we don't like that and we think they should be doing like even that can be an element of stealing, because we're taking from somebody else something that we're not willing to give.
Right. So there's there's different motives that people have, whether there's genuine need, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit tomorrow night. Absolutely. When you're in genuine need, there's things that we covet, which is kind of that 10th commandment where he says, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, slave, wife, like anything that belongs to your neighbor. So this heart desire, but also stealing because, man, I want that. I want that, and I haven't set myself in a position where I can have it on my own, that I can purchase it, trade for it, whatever. And so I'm going to take it by force, by burgling. I found out, robbery and burglary are different
Pastor Bill
things.
explained this to me. So burglarizing is when you are, like, if you go into a house and nobody's home and you steal something, it's burglary.
It's kind of a sneaky way to steal.
It's burglary. But if you're taking from a person, like if you go into a house and somebody's there and taking from a person, that is armed. That's robbery. There's a difference. If there's a person involved, it's robbery. No person involved, it's burglary. So yeah, there's a little bit of this distinction there.
Right.
So sometimes you hear those terms go back and forth.
And this is covered in this over the umbrella of stealing. And so this also gets into the idea of, is it stealing if nobody knows that I took it. Now, in other faiths, I found this was really interesting, reading the testimony of a Muslim man, and he said he grew up in this faith where stealing was only wrong if you were caught stealing.
I've never heard that.
If you were not caught stealing, you could get away with it, and okay, doesn't really matter. Even if you told somebody else later, there wasn't like a judgment that was kind of, man, you shouldn't have done that. That was messed up. It was like, okay, well, if you can get away with it, great. That is not the case here. That belongs to someone. It doesn't belong to you. And so we have to trust that God is going to provide the things in our life that we need. He even tells us to pray about the things that we desire and that we have a want for. Sometimes he will give those things to us at some point, and that may be later on. And sometimes what he does is even cooler, I think, is that he doesn't give us what we desire, but he gives us what to desire. Right?
That's good.
So like the things that we ought to actually be wanting in our life, he begins to work in our hearts so that we want those things also. So my desire when I was growing up, it was like I always got the video games and systems right as like the next system was coming out. So I got the N64 like right before the Wii came out. And so all my friends were getting on this new system, or like, hey, everybody else is getting a PlayStation 2 as I get this Nintendo, and I want to play with all of them, what they're doing, and the coolest new thing. And not, like, that was discontent in my heart. That was not being content with what God had provided for me at that time. But over the course of my life, I haven't stayed on that thing. And, thankfully, I've even been able to grow to not where I really have a strong desire for the newest, latest, greatest of a lot of different things. But there are other places that can show up in our lives where we have this discontentment with the car we drive, with the home we have, with the situation we find ourselves in, and we can just really desire to force something else to be ours that isn't ours to have.
And really what all that is getting into is, I think you hit a lot on the 10th commandment, on that discontent. You should not covet. And that coveting it's a selfish desire, or just a discontent with what you have and wanting what somebody else has. And we're bombarded with this. Like, people make careers and a lot of money in advertising and marketing for a reason. If you see any ad or commercial, it is saying, like, the message between every advertisement is, you need this thing and you're not complete until you have it. Like, you want to talk about influencers, and I know through Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, there's a lot of, really mainly through Instagram, but there's a lot of social influencers. Marketing and advertising are expert influencers. They influence you into desiring a thing and not being content or satisfied until you have that. Like, that is the entire point of marketing and advertising. And what that ultimately does is, we're influenced by that, is it causes us to covet. And ultimately, that coveting, it is, like, it's okay to want certain things.
Sure.
Like even God says it's good to desire spiritual gifts. It's good to desire good things. It's good to desire a good spouse. Like, it's good to desire a wife, as long as it's not somebody else's wife, which we already kind of talked about. Like there's a lot of things that are good to desire. Even like wanting a nicer car or wanting a nicer home. Those aren't bad things. Like right now, I'm trying to talk Amy into buying a Jeep Wrangler. Like, I desire a Jeep Wrangler, but the shift in where it becomes a sin is if I can no longer be content in what the Lord has blessed me with, then I am coveting.
That's right. We wrote down here, coveting is an ungoverned, illegitimate, selfish desire to possess that which belongs to another. It's a longing for something that would require a violation of the moral law in order to obtain it. So it is this desire inside to, I'm going to find a way to get that for myself and not be okay with what I have right now. And so that is something that's wrong. There's a great example in this coveting that we're going to talk about with King David.
Yeah.
And David's often thought of as, the man after God's own heart. He also has some huge struggles in his life, especially with Bathsheba.
Yeah, so this is interesting because we mentioned King David last week a little bit, but now we're going to talk more about King David and how even in that same situation we see his violation of one commandment lead to a violation of many of the commandments, which is often how it happens. So this 10th commandment of not to covet, David saw Bathsheba and lusted after her. So there is what we see Jesus talking about in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is saying, I'm not only concerned with your actions and your words and what you do, but I'm also concerned about your thoughts. That's why it's so important to, as Paul said, take every thought captive. Because sinful thoughts can be like cancer. The longer they go untreated, the more we just let them kind of stay there and grow and gain strength in us, they're just going to be more destructive. So David sees Bathsheba, he lusts after her, which ultimately leads him to taking her into his bed. And so from there, he commits adultery, he sleeps with another man's wife, he calls that man home, tries to send Uriah to sleep with her to cover up the fact that he had just slept with her, so that he would
there's lying involved in that.
There's lying involved there. That absolute deception. Uriah refuses because Uriah is one of my favorites. I've been deployed, I've been to war, so I know what it meant for me to come home.
Sure.
And Uriah, being a man of honor, says he refuses. He will not go in, he will not see his wife. He said, if my men can't come home, I'm not going. It's unfair to them. And so then King David sends Uriah to the front lines, pulls everybody back, has Uriah murdered. So there we see the murder. And then one of my favorite, just kind of confrontational situations in the Bible is Nathan comes in and confronts King David.
Yep. So Nathan is a prophet of God, and he comes in to talk to King David, and he comes about it with a story to tell King David, letting David see the error in his own way. He tells this story about how there's a man who has a sheep, and this man loves this sheep, this one little lamb. He loves it, he cares for it.
Says it eats dinner at the table with his family.
That's right. It is what he's all about. And so David's like, okay, cool. Because you got to remember, David was a shepherd as a kid. So he knows exactly what... He probably had his own favorite sheep.
My son carries around this little stuffed animal lamb that he just calls Lammy. So, David had his Lammy probably.
Absolutely.
And Easton loves that lamb. He's 8 years old and he still carries that thing around.
Yeah.
He loves Lammy. This guy in this story, he loved Lammy.
That's right.
Yeah.
So this one guy has this one sheep. Then there's a guy nearby who has a whole flock of sheep. And he's going to throw a party, and he decides, you know what, instead of slaughtering one of my sheep, I'm just going to go and take this other guy's sheep and slaughter it instead. And David finds out about this, and he's furious. He is not okay with this. He sees the problem in it, and he's like, who is this guy? I'm going to tear this guy up.
Bring him here.
Yeah. He's ready to cast judgment on this guy.
Yeah. Bring him to me.
And so he says this, and Nathan says, this man is you.
You are that man. You have stolen what was a loving possession of somebody else, somebody that loved and they care for it, and you took it for you because you're selfish.
Right. And David is this king. He has so much for himself. He had taken this one thing that was not his to have. He had coveted in his heart that which was someone else's. He had acted upon that, which then led to all of these different things that we've talked about. And Nathan calls him out on it, and David ends up being broken. And this is the part that we see there's redemption, there's restoration, but there's also consequence.
So, David's original sin of a covetous heart led him to commit adultery, led him to lie, and eventually led him to murder in this entire situation. And we see that God still works in and through David, but there are consequences for the remaining of almost David's legacy and his children, his grandchildren, and how how the Lord really kind of brings those consequences to bear in David's proceeding generations, consequent generations. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a huge issue, and like Austin said, when we get to the New Testament, Jesus is talking in the Sermon on the Mount. He's addressing many of these commands, and we're going to go in depth on that next week as we wrap up this series, and we see how Jesus is getting after more of the heart than just the action. But this 10th commandment is pretty heart-oriented, and it should be something for us to each take a few moments and think through, where am I at? Like, even if I can put on a face of being one way, that my heart needs to reflect that as well.
Yeah, as we mentioned in the first week, that first commandment is to have no other gods before God. You can't break any of the commandments without first breaking that first commandment, because what we're doing in that instance is we are placing something over our love for God. But that 10th commandment is not to covet. That's often the reason why we break the other commandments. So this discontent in our hearts, as our hearts are filled with, like, we just can't be satisfied with what we have and what we've been given. What that leads to is that leads to idolatry, that leads to rebellion, that can lead to murder, that can lead to idolatry, it can lead to lying. So not being content in our hearts with what the Lord has blessed us with is what, in acting out on that, that's where we violate these other commandments.
Yep. So tomorrow, as we talk through these 3 commands, we're going to get into some more of the specific applications. And so I encourage you to jump in. Last week we had some really in-depth conversation on all of the implications around that simple "you shall not murder." There was a lot there, so I'm definitely sure there will be a lot more tomorrow. We've got some situational ethics to talk through, to think about.
So do we want to preview so they can be thinking about it?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so for example, Hurricane Katrina. Stealing to survive versus looting. Is it a violation of the commandment not to steal if, depending on your circumstance and your situation, you have to steal in order to survive, like stealing for need purposes?
Yep. So there was a lot of looting around Hurricane Katrina because so vast of an area was just demolished and wrecked and messed up. And so many people had not been able to leave or had decided to stay. And so there was both great need for water, fuel, food, things like that. But there was great opportunity also to take advantage of, hey, my neighbor left his house and they're in another state. I can help myself to whatever is theirs and better myself. So those seem to be 2 different things, but is it okay to do one of those? Is it wrong to do both? We're going to talk through some of that tomorrow.
Yeah, so looking forward to talking to you guys tomorrow on the Zoom call. Remember, middle school's at 7 p.m., high school's at 8 p.m. If you need those links, let us know. We'd love to get those to you.
Sounds good. All right, we'll see you then.
Have a good night, guys.